Refugees are welcome here.
Those were protests outside the Bell Hotel in Epping in Essex, which was housing asylum seekers. But a judge said those protests were part of the reason he was shutting that hotel down and saying it was no longer going to house those asylum seekers. What does this mean for the government's policy on housing them and for politics in general? We'll discuss in this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Well, we can catch up with Home and Legal Affairs' Dominic Casciani, who was reporting on this court case on Tuesday. Hi, Dom.
Hi, Adam.
And also in the normal Newscast studio is political correspondent Joe Pike. Hi, Joe.
Hello, Adam.
Right, Dominic, let's start off with just doing a bit of kind of deep reading of this temporary rule. What do we call it, actually, technically?
It's interim relief, which basically
interim
means
relief.
an injunction to stop something happening, which is in place until everybody comes back to court to really argue out whether the thing which should be stopped should really be stopped.
Yeah, a reminder, we're in the middle of this story rather than the end of it. So what did the judge actually say? Why did he rule that actually those asylum seekers should not be in the Bell?
Well, I mean, look, yesterday, Adam, was one of the strangest days I've had in court for a long time. I mean, on one level, because it was about planning law, which isn't what mere mortals like me are used to dealing with, and it's probably why planning lawyers have paid an absolute arm and a leg. It's really complex stuff. But secondly, because we had this bizarre situation where the Home Secretary's lawyers tried to intervene at the last moment because they were worried about the implications of the judgment, and the judge, Mr. Justice Eyre, wasn't having any of that. He said, "Well, you could have done all of this last week. You could have intervened then." And then he came back into court.
This was a case between Epping, the local authority, and the private company that puts the asylum seekers in the hotel.
Precisely. And the Home Secretary had been put on notice that the case was going ahead. But no lawyers were available, which I think is code for they may have all been on the Dordogne last week. But the things got even more surreal when the judge then came back into court to actually deliver his ruling and said to the court, "Well, I've delivered my ruling," except he delivered it by email to the parties in the court, and everybody on the press bench was sitting there saying, "Yeah, but what is it?" And they carried on the hearing about what happens next, and we had to effectively interpret from how people were reacting, who had won and who had lost, which is a slightly odd situation, but it's like existential angst for a court reporter not to be able to say what a judge has actually said, because we actually hadn't seen the copy of it. But when we did see a copy of it, very weird. When we did see a copy of it, what we saw was a very nuanced ruling, which really hammers home Epping Forest's case that they have real concerns about what's going on in their local area. But it's a real headache for the Home Office. Now, it's not a nightmare. The court didn't say all asylum hotels must now be emptied from next week, but it did basically set criteria which other councils may use. Now, the key thing in this is to go back a little bit. Can I go back to 2022 briefly? I won't do the Wikipedia version. Yeah. So in 2022, a bunch of councils that year tried to get injunctions and largely failed to stop the Home Office and its contractors using hotels in their areas. And there was one particular case involving Ipswich and Hull, where those two councils challenged the use of hotels in their areas. And what the court said at the time was, look, there's no evidence of harm so far. And critically, the court had to take into account the wider public interest, which includes the Home Secretary's duty to house people, to house asylum seekers. That's a duty imposed on the Home Secretary by Parliament. So, in fact, the court said, well, what do you expect us to do? The Home Secretary's got to put people places. They've run out of accommodation. These hotels are available. Crack on. And that, in many respects, seemed to be the end of it, other than a few outlier decisions. Great Yarmouth, for instance, won a case because the hotel being selected in that town was on the seafront and part of its tourism space. So they won theirs. But that was a pretty unusual one. What made a difference today, though, was how things have panned out over the last month in Epping itself. So we've had the Bell Hotel, we've had the protests. Some of those protests have become unlawful. There have been clashes with the police. And all of this in planning terms impacted the enjoyment of the area and the character of the area for people who live there. Now, what the judge said is that he wasn't interested that there'd been lawful protests. That's you have to tolerate lawful protests. That's the price of living in a free society. And the threat of a protest per se cannot operate as some kind of veto preventing the Home Office and its contractors from carrying out some other public purpose in the public interest. But what he did say was, because Epping had an arguable case that the hotel was in breach of planning rules, in effect, it had ceased to be a hotel. It was some kind of hostel on one level. That's an arguable point, which will have to come back to court in October, because that was the council's argument that there had been an unlawful breach. And that, in turn, had led to these really, really quite concerning protests. The judge said he was entitled to take that risk of irreparable harm to the local area into account, and therefore issue this stop order telling the hotel's owners to effectively, well, he gave them until the 12th of September, Adam, to remove everybody. And that means the Home Office has got to find other places to put them. So the consequence of that is a clear ruling linking the idea of an alleged unlawful act by the hotel with the consequences of that being local disturbances, fear of crime, a changing of a sense of place. And those two things together, the real question is whether or not that's now going to open the gateway for other councils to try and do the same thing as Epping Forest.
Yeah, and Dominic, I'm glad you said all that, because when I first read the reports about this on Tuesday, I thought, oh, this has been kiboshed because of the planning regulations. And I thought it's because this hotel was actually being used as a hostel, which the law sees differently from a hotel. And I thought, oh, actually, it's nothing really to do with the protests at all. But then once you read the judgment and you read a bit more around it and you talk to people like you hear, no, the protests actually were quite a big factor in the judge interpreting how planning law is meant to work. So actually, it's not that there's planning law over here and protests over there. The two actually have merged in a way in this story. So Joe, let's talk about some of the political consequences. I mean, first of all, what's the Home Office doing about housing the people that can't be housed in the Bell Hotel anymore? Do we know?
We don't. They say they are considering what to do next, but a minister from that department who was touring the TV and radio studios this morning couldn't provide much clarity. Certainly from conversations I've had from people who work in the Home Office so far suggest that they are pretty disappointed, frustrated, weary. Certainly I've been on duty over the summer covering politics, and that is the department I've been on the phone to most often on topics like prescribing Palestine action on small boats, on this one in, one out France deal, on hotel protests. And now, they've almost got a sort of extra legal curveball added into the mix. Certainly, I'm told Yvette Cooper had this on her radar about a week ago and immediately realised the implications, the precedent that could potentially be set. Of course, that's as Dom explained, why Home Office lawyers tried to get involved. And now we're also seeing other political parties getting in on the action and putting their views as to what should happen next, in particular in other communities across England where there are hotels housing migrants.
Well, yeah, let's go through the political parties, or some of them then. What are Reform saying about it? Because this is prime political territory for them.
They are framing it, Adam, as a victory. I spoke to Zia Youssef earlier today, who used to be the chairman of the party, now runs this Doge operation for Nigel Farage. He delivered, really, I suppose it was a sort of rallying call for people to protest outside hotels in their communities, but protest peacefully. He also said that Reform-run councils will be studying what has happened in Epping and taking legal advice. There are 12 Reform councils. Only a very small portion of them have planning and housing powers, so they can't all get involved here. But one of those councils, West Northamptonshire, has 3 hotels in its area, and they've told us they are looking at what they can do. So Reform, partly because, as Dom has explained, the protest being part of the judge's consideration, are now encouraging further protests in an effort to try and close down more hotels.
And yeah, Dom, it's impossible to predict what happens in other court cases, but what does this one tell us, or pointers does this one give us about when, places like West Northamptonshire try and do this for their area?
I think there are a number of layers to this. So I think the first question for many councils who may be tempted to go down this route, and it's a very expensive and difficult route for them to land, is one of the first things is have they exhausted all local remedies? So one of the issues in other cases, so let's take South Norfolk Council, for instance, they're saying they're not going to go to the courts and they're going to try to enforce local planning rules before going down the injunction route because they think that's going to be of more success. And one of the issues in this case was why had the council not actually taken any enforcement action in Epping Forest in a manner that they may have been expected to do so. So there are complications around this which make the Epping issue fact specific. I think the issue about the protests, though, this is a really interesting one, really, because what the Home Office's lawyers said yesterday is if the interim injunction is granted, it could act as an impetus for further protests, and those protests could be unlawful. And so the question is at what level and at what kind of size of protest outside an asylum hotel does suddenly that reach a tipping point where a local authority may want to go to court and try and get an injunction in a similar way to Epping Forest? And I think there's obviously political risk around this as well. So if you think about the fact that Nigel Farage has said people should come out and in his words lawfully protest, what happens if those lawful protests get hijacked by criminal elements? Politically, that could become quite awkward for him or anyone else who's actually backing such process in the hope of putting pressure. Yeah, so it's very difficult, this. I think long term, though, I think there's a really interesting point about where the government is really heading on asylum accommodation per se. Hotels were never part of the equation until the backlog exploded, partly because of poor decision making in the Home Office after 2018, but also because of the pandemic. One of the things the Labour government has hung on to is a site near Braintree, which is a converted military site, and it seems to be expanding it to hold to accommodate more asylum seekers. Now, that's taking the British government closer to the German model, and the Germans they've long organised big reception centres, self-contained, all the facilities there, healthcare, education, all the rest of this, integration, all those kind of things, self-contained. So you're not putting people in local communities. 20 odd years ago, Tony Blair's government were tempted to go down that route, and they never felt they had the political capital to actually make it work. And I'm just wondering whether we're going to end up with Keir Starmer thinking, I've got a lot of poor options here, but this is the least worst one. And maybe that's where we're going to end up. And slowly over the course of the Parliament, if the numbers don't start coming down, they'll move to that model because the Germans have shown they can make it work.
And Joe, the pressure on the government here, because Yvette Cooper had said we'll stop using asylum hotels by the end of this Parliament, but that sounds like that's too far away for a lot of people now.
Absolutely. Although Yvette Cooper's team say they are sticking to that commitment and it is achievable, but clearly people are frustrated. The opinion polls and the fact that immigration is reaching the top, according to a lot of pollsters of concerns of voters, is a big part of that. And this is clearly partly a political debate as well. The fact we've seen opposition parties, at least on the right, wanting to get in front of TV cameras today shows how salient the issue is. We've talked about reform, but the Conservatives have also been out talking. Chris Philp, who's the Shadow Home Secretary, saying that people who are moved out of the belt, and we think around 140 men are currently being housed there, they should now be housed, he says, on barges or military bases. He wants the government to commit to not using any hotels or flats or HMOs. He wants illegal migrants to be...
They're houses of multiple occupancy, so basically like collections of bedsitters.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He wants illegal migrants supported on arrival, and he also wants an emergency cabinet meeting. We should also point out Mr. Philp, who's pretty prominent at the moment and on the airwaves a lot, was Border Security Minister for a couple of years under Boris Johnson.
Yeah, and it is a tricky one for the Tories because they're trying to stop their supporters and their voters flocking to Reform, who are quite hardline on this. But equally, they were in government for a long time, and actually the peak of the number of people in hotels while they were waiting for their asylum claims to be processed was under the Conservative government.
It was. It reduced towards the end of their time in office. I was actually in Epping last week with Kemi Badenoch on a trip there, which didn't get much coverage, but I think was intended for her to find facts about what was happening on the ground, but also quite carefully enter the debate and the space that has been so sort of forcibly occupied by Reform on asylum hotels. And it was interesting, Adam, on that very point to see the reception she got. Yeah, there were a lot of people who received her well and wanted selfies, but there were others who were slightly hostile and on a number of different fronts. And one of them was saying to her that the Conservatives in their 14 years in power have cut back local services, including police. And so it is difficult for her to articulate many of those arguments too forcefully. The other thing I should say about my time in Epping is even though there were a lot of people who were clearly very frustrated about the effect of that asylum hotel, its impact, they argued, on public safety, there were other people I spoke to who argued it was the protests themselves which have caused the problems and were far more sympathetic to the people who are housed at the Bell.
And also, Joe, just paint a bit of a picture of what the Bell Hotel was like. And I don't mean as the site of protests and counter-protests, but as a place where people were being housed while their asylum claims were processed. What could you tell from the outside?
Well, it is not a hotel like we'd know it in the sense that, well, I suppose it's in the sense that you don't pay for it, right? It has 80 rooms, mostly double occupancy. So 138 people is the maximum people that can be housed there. Now,
so it's people sharing rooms with other people they don't know.
You don't get to choose your room or who your roommate is. You need to sign in every day to mark that you are there. And if you're away for more than a day, you need to let the Home Office know that. And it is all men, all single men. This isn't somewhere where families are housed. But it was various arrests linked to the hotel, which seemed to spark, at least according to the judge, the unrest. And this hotel on the edge of Epping had been not in a great place, certainly pre-pandemic. It was, according to its owners, making a loss. During COVID, it was used to house homeless people, including some asylum seekers. And actually, for 18 months under the Conservatives, it was an asylum hotel. It then closed down and reopened in April of this year.
And Dominic, it was interesting listening to our colleague Daniel Samford on the radio earlier on today, who's been covering home affairs for a long time as well. And he said the main thing he got whenever he went to these facilities or these hotels or these hostels, whatever you want to call it, is the sense of boredom, because the people in them, because they're asylum seekers, under the law, they're not allowed to work. They get some money from the state to live on, but it's not a huge amount. And also, it's not like being in a health spa or a centre parks where there's loads of activities to do. And he just said the sense you get is just boredom.
Yeah. Look, I've met plenty of asylum seekers down the years in various places they've been accommodated, and it is mind-numbingly boring, not least because they can't work, and that bar is in place to prevent illegal working and effectively people trying to use the asylum route as a means of getting into the British economy. I mean, in terms of cash, good fact to put out there. If an asylum seeker is in some of the Home Office's privately rented accommodation, which is typically basically a family, where the Home Office system effectively provides them a very, very cheap house, typically in the poorest areas of some of the poorest towns in the country, they get £49.18 per person a week to spend on everything. If you're in a hotel where your meals are being provided, you get £9.95. So these are way, way below the levels of benefits which people who are legally resident in the UK are entitled to. It's very, very little money. And they do literally sit around for months and months and months waiting for a decision. So it is quite a sort of like chronically boring thing. But you see, this then brings us back to the fundamental issue about why hotels are being used. People are sitting around for ages waiting for a decision because the backlogs have grown and grown and grown because the Home Office became exceptionally poor at dealing with cases and processing people to a point where they were either allowed to settle as genuine refugees and therefore allowed to work and pay their way, or we were told they were going to be removed. I mean, 2014, 9 out of 10 of cases were dealt with in under 6 months. And by around 2022, that dropped to just 6 out of 100. It was a staggering drop. And that's why the backlog's grown, and that's why people are sitting around.
Yeah, because I did an episode of Antisocial on Radio 4 about this last week, and you can listen to that on BBC Sounds if you'd like to hear it. And I mean, it got really, really heated. In fact, one of the most heated episodes we've done like all year. But for me, the penny really dropped when I was doing that episode, and you realise the sort of the 3 structural things that are combining here. Number one, what you just said, Dom, the asylum system at the moment is so slow, and there are loads of reasons and causes for that. But the main thing is it's just really slow. The second thing is governments are obliged to provide asylum seekers with accommodation. So you can't just have people sleeping in the streets, because actually that's what happens in France, and that's why you have these big camps. And then thirdly, this accommodation isn't provided by the government. It's privatized. It's 3 big companies that are meant to be providing accommodation on behalf of the government so they can meet their legal objective of housing people who are in the asylum system for sometimes a lot of years. And then actually I said there was 3 things. There's then a 4th thing that one of the experts we spoke to said. He said, look, you want to be careful here because the rate of granting of asylum means that more than half of the people that are in the system end up staying in Britain because they're granted asylum and get refugee status. And do you really want to be having a situation where people have been cooped up in really not very nice accommodation, being demonized by some protesters and having done nothing and been really bored for 2 years, if actually that person's going to become sort of quasi-British at the end of the process and stay here forever?
There is an interesting comparison here with Spain and some parts of France, actually, in fairness to the French. They do have another model which is particularly focused around families, where they are accommodated during the application process as refugees in residences, which very often kind of resemble student halls or student flats, if you see what I mean. And the idea of that model, and these places are run by charities and NGOs, is to try to get those people, give them a better chance of integrating during the process. So there are French lessons, they get the kids into school, those kind of things. And supporters of that system say it works because it's dealing with small numbers of people in communities and helping them very, very quickly kind of start to move on. The difficulty with our system, and we're in a pretty unusual situation, is in effect, we're putting people into accommodation around the country in a national dispersal system, be it privately rented digs or hotels, but there's not a lot of support around those people. And that's where very often a lot of the tension starts building. These people have got nothing to do. They go outside, they mill around outside because they're not being held as prisoners. Local people are wondering who these guys are who are hanging around, particularly these young male men. I was talking to the leader of Epping Forest Council yesterday, Chris Whitbread, and he describes his town as a lovely town, a happy town, a friendly town. And all of a sudden, everyone's kind of mystified about who these young men are, where have they come from. And that kind of changing of a sense of place really plays into people's trust in the state and political parties. And, inevitably for some, tips over from, legitimate debate and protest into what we've seen with some of the clashes in Epping Forest and elsewhere on occasion.
And Joe, just before you go, on a completely different note, you were saying that you spend all summer phoning the Home Office, but in the last few days, have you found yourself calling the Treasury because there's so many ideas for how to reform property taxes in the budget in the autumn popping up in newspapers every day? There's a lot of Treasury stuff in the air.
Absolutely. And my understanding of the inner workings of the Treasury at the moment is that, especially in August, some of them are resting, relaxing, trying to escape London and work for a bit, but others are hunkering down, trying to work out strategy, tactics for what to do next, because various economic think tanks have been pretty blunt about the the sort of hole in the public finances, the gap that Rachel Reeves needs to fill. But I'm told once Parliament's back in September, I think we're likely to see a lot more of the Chancellor and maybe more details on different things she intends to do ahead of the budget.
Yeah, and sorry, me and Joe are sounding a little bit cryptic there, but some of the ideas that have been floated in the papers in the last few days, and they're all around property taxes, are things like, do you abolish stamp duty, so what you pay when you buy a property over a certain value, and do you replace that with a sort of annual property tax where you pay a little bit on the basis of the value of your property every year, rather than a huge chunk on the basis of the value of your property up front when you buy it. And then the one that was in some of the papers today on Wednesday, as we're recording this episode of Newscast, is that you get rid of the exemption for paying capital gains tax on your main home for properties above a certain value. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the sort of things we're having to phone the Treasury to ask them to confirm or deny, which they neither confirm or deny about.
A capital gains mansion tax is what it's being called.
Cat's catchy.
Very catchy.
Capital gains mansion tax. Joe, thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam.
And Dominic, thank you very much to you too.
Thank you, Adam. Cheers.
And that's all we've got time to show you on Newscast, but we recorded so much more than that, and you can hear it in the podcast edition of Newscast, which is available to download now on BBC Sounds. And we'll be back with another episode very soon. Bye-bye.